one more comment on the complementary nature of opposites as illustrated by the yin-yang symbol. And it's related to what Jung saw as the essence of Greek wisdom. Exaggerate nothing. All good lies in the right measure. So yellow is the color of the mean in Chinese culture, and the reason that the Wilhelm Baines translation of the I Ching has a yellow cover. Jung also quoted a related statement from John Glauer: a warring peace, a sweet wound, an agreeable evil. So here is my very well used copy of the I Ching. It's kind of falling apart. Whoops. Been using it since 1975, but this is the yellow cover that the English translation of the Jing comes in. So the Greeks couldn't distinguish between the goddess truth and the goddess deception, because there's an element of mystery in every truth. Deception supports ambiguity and prevents knowledge from being threatened by any one belief from becoming absolute. So let's look again at Jung's definition of amplification. So if you could get the next slide. So amplification is defined as the elaboration and clarification of a dream image by two means. Directed association is the spontaneous ideas which proceed from a given dream situation and constantly related to it. And second, the parallels from the human sciences, symbology, mythology, mysticism, folklore, history of religion, ethnology, and so on. So I gave several examples of the second part of the definition of the parallels from the human sciences in lecture 2. I illustrated the archetypes of the conservation of energy proposed as a scientific construct by Robert Mayer in the 19th century that has appeared in various cultural traditions in very different historical periods. As Jung said, the primitive dynamistic religions described it as a universal magical power about which everything revolves, the earliest form of a concept of God among the primitives. It is God appearing in a burning bush in the Old Testament. Next slide. The Holy Ghost as fiery tongues from heaven in the New Testament. A world energy as ever-living fire from a pre-Socratic Greek, and chi energy for the Chinese. So another example I gave was in Jung's discussion of the woman who dreamt of her father as a giant of a man, holding her like a little girl and rocking her as the wind swept over the wheat fields. Jung amplified her passionate longing for a godlike figure with the 13th century German mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg, who wrote ecstatic poetry and allegories about her love of God. Then Jung mentioned the pagan nature demon of Norse mythology, Wotan, the great musician of the gods and the god of poets and war heroes. This is an example of what Jung called the religious function of the psyche, that even in dreams of a non-believer, it can produce these sacred images like God-like images. So Jung picked up on the original form of God as spirit, meaning wind, looking at the Hebrew ruah and the Arabic ruh, meaning breath and spirit. Amplifications like this make an individual feel part of our species' history and traditions. It helps us get out of our personal ego-bound world and puts us into the community of humankind as it deepens our sense of self and feel a connection to a more universal, archetypal, and timeless realm. So not mentioned in the definition of amplification is what Jung called, quote, the method of the necessary statement, end of quote. He was referring to mathematical expressions of relationships that go beyond empirical comprehension and compared the elaborate formulation of mathematical concepts to, quote, the disciplined imagination to build up images of intangibles by logical principles and on the basis of empirical data, that is, on the evidence of dreams, end of quote. Quote, the method of the necessary statements, unquote, Jung said, can most easily be demonstrated by the statement implicit in simple whole numbers. So one, as the first numeral, is unity, but it is also the unity, the one, all oneness, individuality and non-duality, not a number, but a philosophical concept, an archetype, an attribute of God, the monad. It is quite proper that the human intellect should make these statements, but at the same time, the intellect is determined and limited by the concept of oneness and its implications. In other words, the statements are not arbitrary. They are governed by the nature of oneness and therefore are necessary statements, end of quote. Jung also adds, theoretically, the same logical operation could be formed for each of the following conceptions of number, but in practice, the process soon comes to an end because of the rapid increase in complication, which becomes too numerous to handle. So Jung added the properties of the first 10 numbers out of the infinite series of numbers represents an abstract cosmogony derived from the monad. The properties of numbers are simultaneously the properties of matter, for which reason certain equations can anticipate its behavior, saying, equations governing the turbulence of heated gases existed long before the problems of such gases had been precisely investigated. Similarly, we have long been in the possession of mythogens, which express the dynamics of certain subliminal processes, though these processes were only given names in recent times. So think of how the archetypal motif in a fairy tale like Snow White long preceded the articulation of the psychological concept and psychodynamics behind the narcissistic wound and the narcissistic character disorder. Here is an image of Snow White after she ate the poisoned apple from her mother, when her magic mirror said her daughter had grown to be more beautiful than her. The rational verbal psychological descriptions lack the intensity of feeling and associated imagery in the fairy tale with a narrative that best captures the narcissistic personality. So with reference to the necessary statements about a particular archetype, compare the archetypal images of the Great Mother, pregnant or nursing, as generative and nurturing human nature, in contrast to the generativity of the male as phallic, assertive, impregnating energy, mythologically portrayed by male fertility gods across cultures and historical periods, with the phallic-y side of Hermes being a good example from Western culture, and that's the famous Athenian Hermes statue on the right from about 500 BCE. So Jung said that the I Ching is a book of archetypes. The I Ching has a binary code base as depicted by the Fu Shi arrangement of hexagrams, the binary code being what computers run on. My hypothesis is that the I Ching is such a phenomenal book of wisdom and philosophy because China discovered the binary code very early in its history, and that shaped the thinking of the sages, artists, and philosophers. They were able to describe 4,096 archetypal situations in nature and in the psyche, 4,096 being the total number of combinations that one can have with 6 lines and 4 possible situations in each line. The first step toward putting the total abstraction of numbers into metaphors and imagery was to use yin and yang lines, that going back to Chinese shamanism in prehistory. Jung called numbers the purest form of archetypes, and he described, as I mentioned before, how numbers could predict the qualities and behavior of matter But he also said that numbers, and I think this is what the Chinese sages demonstrated, that numbers are also descriptive of archetypal situations in the human psyche. So with the 6-line hexagrams, the sages were able to play with the archetypal significance of upper and lower, as with the trigrams, top and bottom, as with the lines in the trigrams, correspondence between lines, natural yin and yang positions, etc. The host of descriptions available to English-speaking people in the structural descriptions of the meaning of the hexagrams in the third section of the Wilhelm Baines translation of the I Ching. And what is I've always been struck with is by the third and the fourth lines. So you're going from the lower trigram to the upper, and notice that the third line is about the individual and the fourth line is social. And in the chakras, the third position is associated with the solar complex and like power, and the fourth line is associated with the heart. So when you go from individual to being able to relate to somebody else, that's a huge transition. So I gave a lecture on this 2 years ago, which has been translated into Chinese, and it's available on my website. So the next slide. So I used a diagram to illustrate how the 64 archetypal life and natural world experiences, the hexagrams, were developed schematically from the original yin and yang lines coming from the yin-yang symbol as the first manifestation of the Tao, that which points to the source, the origin of the 10,000 things. Yes, so that's another illustration of the symbol in the middle, which doesn't really show a separation of the opposites, but you can see how the trigrams emerging from that, and eventually all of the hexagrams in the outer circle. And this is another image of that. The supreme ultimate would be that white line at the bottom, and then you see yin and yang, and eventually at the top, all of the hexagrams. So this is a photo of a Taoist priest robe, and you might notice the hexagrams on the bottom. And if you could point out that above that lower band, it looks like kind of there are waves kind of parting and sort of like a phallic image moving up toward a dragon. I see the swan head within the white circle, within the blue and black circles in the middle, as an image for the source, the origin, or what Lao Tzu called the Tao. The dragon holding up the yin-yang symbol would be Hermes in our Western mythology, because Hermes is the god of the transitional spaces. In this case, the transition between existence and non-existence, first presented in symbolic form as the yin-yang symbol. And you will notice that there are 4 dragons around that Hermes figure and the yin-yang symbol. That would be, so those 4 dragons would be like on this chart, summer, spring, autumn, and winter. Those 4 phases in any cycle of change that I illustrated in that video, Seasons of the Soul. And I think you have the Chinese version of that presentation that is online. And again, the diagram showing the emergence of consciousness, discriminating between things as the yin and yang lines coming out of the yin-yang symbol. Like I said, I developed this hypothesis in some detail in the Orange County Friends of C.G. Jung lecture that has a Chinese translation. So for those of us familiar with and loving the I Ching, it becomes an important source for amplification of imagery in dreams and cultural phenomena like music and film. We Western Jungian analysts envy the Chinese for the many, many avenues for working archetypally and imaginally out of your rich cultural tradition. beginning with the fact that many of your words still have an image base. My favorite example that I learned in a private study group in Zurich was the ideogram for the sage described as, quote, the ear listening to the inner king, unquote. This describes the process of becoming and being a sage rather than describing the attributes of a sage. How ingenious. This illustrates the power of the image, with the inner king in Jungian terms being the self, which, as I mentioned before, could be a spirit animal or, for me, a sacred landscape. Engineering professor here, Chinese engineering professor here in Milwaukee, told me that the king is that lower line with a cross on it, and he said it represented a warrior who became a chief. So the idea of an inner king as the warrior chief would be related in American Indian culture to somebody like Black Elk that I mentioned in an earlier lecture. So in Judaism, it would be like King David, who was a famous warrior king in ancient Jewish culture. So the book that I have with the most comprehensive description of the many dimensions of the I Ching that can be used for amplification is the Book of Changes and the Unchanging Truth by Taoist Master Ni Wat Ching. There you see the yellow emperor looking at a tortoise or a turtle coming out of the river, I'm not sure which, and it has, I think it has the trigrams inscribed on its shell. That was a recording of the presentation I gave last November. I think it was shown at the Chinese Sandplay conference in December. So I think that should be available. Yes, it's available on my website, and presumably it's available on some website that you would have as well. But it's a great example of the significance of directions and the order it produced into a year and a half of a very complex series of dreams. And those were the dreams I presented last fall in China.
See the third line. So would you please comment on it since they have knowledge about it?
That was a concept important to Jung. The monad was like my understanding is like this self-contained unit. I don't know what mythic system that is from, but like I said, it was a term that Jung often used. But it's basically it's kind of like a spiritual and philosophical concept, part of that gestalt of the meanings of one and unity and non-duality and that sort of stuff. But okay, here's the answer. Here's the general index to the collected works. So I looked under monad, and there's a lot of listings. First is Gnostic, as like the anthropos, the first man, the son of man. It's from Kilchner's system. It's related to the lapis, the microcosm, the monogenes, the prima materia, and alchemy. Those are some of the main associations to the monad. This is I will be mentioning this as one of the prime Jungian works for doing amplification.
Quark, Q-U-A-R-K. And theoretically, it is the fundamental particle, smaller than atom.
Right. Yeah, that whole domain of nuclear physics, it's one of the fundamental qualities. My knowledge of that area is not that great, but some lecture by Joseph Cambry, who has a pretty good grasp, I think, of nuclear physics, would be a person to think about there. What I might add is that I saw a public TV program about the very fundamental level of reality where I think it's called a quantum flux or something, where things can come in and out of existence and time can go forward and backward. It's something of that realm. And I kind of think of that level as being like the Hermes realm and just the first manifestations out of the Tao. One of my images for the gap in Hermes wand is like the Northern Lights, what happens there. But I also kind of think of those dragons, those Chinese dragons. It always seems like they're shimmering to me. And I kind of think of that as the clouds out of which rains and things like that come. But it's something that you can't kind of physically grab a hold of, but there's some reality to it. So it's that relationship to Hermes as something that can appear and disappear. That's why I put Hermes, I associated Hermes with that figure in the Taoist robe. I might add one thing, and like I said, I'm not that knowledgeable in nuclear physics, quantum mechanics, and so on. But I did hear something some years ago that really piqued my interest because of my interest in the I Ching. I heard a mathematician or a nuclear physicist speculating that beneath the quantum flux or the quantum reality, if you will, it's a binary code or a binary existence. And I thought, oh my gosh, maybe those Chinese sages were right when they said that the book was created by men of cosmic intelligence. So what is most important is learning how to work with archetypes, symbols, and archetypal imagery. So for this, I'm most grateful for my training at the original Jung Institute in Zurich. And this is the location in Küsnacht. We moved down there after the original site in Zurich. And that's where I heard from some of the last of the first generation of Jungian analysts. I think the most important thing for a Jungian analyst is to have an archetypal and symbolic eye. There have been many times in my 40 years of practicing as an analyst that I have said something in a session about a symbol, and I thought to myself, I've never read anything about that symbol, but there is a symbolic logic to what I just said. Coco, I might add that Lake Zurich is to the right, and to our back, a few blocks up is Jung's house on the side of Lake Zurich. And to the right also is facing to the west. So the main impetus for developing a symbolic eye was having to pass a 6-hour exam on fairy tales. You were given an exam, a fairy tale you'd never seen, and you can use all the symbol dictionaries you want to produce a written interpretation in 6 hours to be graded by 3 fairy tale experts. I practiced with a small group for over a year. Fairy tales are particularly good practice because Mary Louise von Franz called them the purest form of the archetypes and are more generic than myths. That's the building where I took my fairy tale exam. A top floor on the left, that's the library. So I was in there for 6 hours. But what I just realized, and I'll try to diagram it here, I woke up the morning of my exam, and at the end of a dream, I was given a hexagram from the I Ching. And then I was given a very simple form of it that I couldn't forget. And I'm drawing it out now. So hang on here. And I looked it up. It was a very positive hexagram. This is the image. That was the last form I was given for the hexagram, a block form. you can see it would be a changing line in the 5th place, which changes to the creative. So needless to say, I did very well on my 6-hour fairy tale exam. This is the simple version of it. So there would be, on the bottom would be that big chunk. Initially, I was given 4 bold black lines, and then a space for a line, and then a big bold black line at the top. And then, so Dumbo, like me, won't forget it, I was given this simple form of just one big block on the bottom and one big line on the top. The hexagram is 14, possession in great measure.
大有卦. Yeah.
And the changing line in the 5th place says, he whose truth is accessible, yet dignified, has good fortune. So the situation is very favorable. I also had a dream one time where I was looking at various elements in the environment, and I could see like a trigram disappearing into those elements, like a bush or a tree or a river or something like that. I could see a trigram form and disappear into those different elements. This morning, I also had a dream in Zurich where I was talking to a woman, and there was sort of like a big kind of flattened balloon, and there was like a little statue inside. And I was telling the woman, like, within every complex, there's a statue of a god, which would be like the archetypal base of a complex would be like a god or a goddess, but that would be related to me seeing trigrams disappearing into elements of the environment, because those trigrams are archetypal situations. So this is the collection of Grimm's fairy tales, and those are the fairy tales that we practiced on in my little fairy tale group. So an ideal place for Jungians to begin with amplification, excuse me, is volume 20, excuse me, the general index of Jung's collected works. One also needs a collection of good symbol dictionaries to amplify archetypal and symbolic material. So one of my favorites is a dictionary of symbols by Jean Chevalier and Alain Gerbrand that includes symbols from Asia and Africa, as well as Europe and America. So a book of symbols, Reflections on Archetypal Images, is a beautifully done and put together book by Jungians. So medicine cards, The Discovery of Power Through the Way of Animals by Jamie Sams and David Carlson is a must for American analysts, because it has excellent Native American entries about 44 American birds and animals. The Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets by Barbara G. Walker provides a feminist dimension to symbolism not covered as well in many symbol dictionaries. So the classic for working European materials is the Dictionary of Symbols and Imagery by Ad de Vries. This is the main dictionary our fairy tale group used as we practiced fairy tale interpretation, mostly on the Grimm's fairy tales, collected and arranged by the Grimm's brothers in Germany in the 1800s. It took me 3 days to work up each of 4 fairy tales for a presentation to the trainees at the Chicago Jung Institute, because I looked up the symbolism for every element in the tale. I photocopy the symbol descriptions for the students so they can get a feel for how to work with symbols in fairy tales. A powerful symbol like a snake has 4 pages of association in de Vries, and the lion has over 2 pages of associations. So here is an example of a little but very significant symbol in the fairy tale Cinderella. A twig of hazel that knocked off her father's hat and really was the turning point in the fairy tale. The first 3 categories under hazel, you see that on the page on the left, are the great goddess, knowledge, wisdom, poetic art, and love and fertility. So it is helpful to think of each symbol like a disco ball, where every mirror on the ball is an individual association of that symbol. One then selects the particular association or associations for each symbol that fits the emerging storyline of the fairy tale. So the storyline is like the string that holds together all the relevant associations from individual disco balls to form a greater gestalt where every element is related to every other element in the story. So Cinderella is mostly about the cruel and inhuman treatment Cinderella received from her stepmother and stepsisters. And one of the associations for Hazel under the folklore category for Hazel is a, quote, counter charm against witches. A branch was often put in a horse harness to protect it against evil spirits. So the method is related to the first part of the definition of amplification, quote, directed association, end of quote, is the spontaneous ideas which proceed from a given dream situation and constantly related to it, end of quote there. But it applies more directly to how one works with an individual's associations to the elements of a dream without many archetypal elements. One does not free associate endlessly to a particular word in the dream, but keep associations related to the storyline of the dream. One usually has to play around with a dream, a mutual process with the analysand, until things begin to emerge. Even though I've been working with dreams for over 40 years, about half the time I have no idea what a dream is about when I first hear it. So a good docent will deepen a viewer's appreciation and emergence into a great work of art by pointing out and elaborating various aspects of the painting.
Sorry, Dennis, what does mean of the docent?
That's what this woman is doing. It's like when you go on a tour in a museum and you have an expert describing what the painting is about. And so speaking of images, and dream images in particular, I love what Jung had to say after discussing a case with dreams in volume 7. Okay, so Jung said, all we have been forced to discuss here in such a tedious and long-winded detail in order to understand it properly, the dream has condensed into a few vivid metaphors, thus creating a picture that works far more effectively on the imagination, feeling, and understanding of the dreamer than any learned discourse. Consequently, the patient was better and more intelligently prepared for the treatment than if he had been overwhelmed with medical and pedagogical maxims. For that reason, I regard dreams not only as a valuable source of information, but as an extraordinary effective instrument of education. So Jung said, on paper, the interpretation of a dream may look arbitrary, muddled, and spurious, but the same thing in reality can be a little drama of unsurpassed realism. To experience a dream and its interpretation is very different from having a tepid rehash set before you on paper. Everything about this, which is Jung's psychology, is, in the deepest sense, experience. The entire theory, even when it puts on the most abstract airs, is the direct outcome of something experienced. So Jung described dreams as being natural products arising spontaneously outside of conscious control, being therefore objective. They hint at, quote, at uncertain basic trends in the psychic process, giving a sense of objective causality and objective tendencies, which is teleology, because dreams are nothing less than self-representations of psychic life process. So I would add another aspect of amplification, and that is illustrated by how I worked with my sacred meadow dream. I took that single image dream received over 41 years ago as hexagram 1, the creative in the I Ching, which is about the spirit and inspiration. Hexagram 2, the receptive, is to be guided by that spirit to embody it in space and time. So this is symbolically depicted as squaring the circle. The image for the creative is a circle, and a square is the image for the receptive. My amplification has been to study the many dimensions of the natural environment in Wisconsin, its landscapes and seasons, which I continue to do as illustrated by the 2-minute video I did for the opening remarks for the Sand Play conference in China last November and December, and that's on the internet. So land, weather, seasons, insects, an archetypal view is basically an amplification of the Meadow Dream. On the back cover, I describe the process of working the Meadow Dream as, quote, turning a landscape into a soulscape, end quote, through the use of science, myths, symbols, dreams, Native American spirituality, imaginal psychology, and the I Ching. Adding that it is an approach that can be used to develop a deep connection with any landscape, meeting one of the goals of ecopsychology. I want to emphasize that this illustrates amplification in its broadest sense. So you can see why I chose this image for squaring the circle. If a man's anima is the image of his soul, squaring the circle for me would be embodying the sacred Meadow Dream, hexagram 1 to hexagram 2. And so ends my presentation on amplification, presented to you from my embodied position here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Shei. Maybe you could quickly just flip through the rest of the slides so people will know what's there. Talk about properties of organism, and then complexity theory. Hermes is the god of complexity theory, and a chart illustrating various things about Hermes, and just keep on flipping through it. And I might just add that like I said, this is far beyond amplification, but a big interest in the planet right now is in artificial intelligence. I know that's one of the areas, one of the 10 areas the Chinese are really specializing in. And one of the more unique aspects of that is called emergent phenomena. And that is directly related, as I see it, mythologically to Hermes. So I think Hermes is going to be a kind of a mythological framework for this very important aspect of artificial intelligence. So let's have some time for some questions here.
And Xianqing has a comment in such a comprehensive illustration of the amplification.
Yeah, I kind of expanded on Jung's definition, but you can see the influence the I Ching has had on me in what I consider to be personally my most important amplification, namely of that sacred Meadow Dream in China that I had in China, Freudian slip that I had in Zurich. Coco, I might add that interest in the I Ching and the Jungian world is much stronger from kind of my generation of Jungian analysts. I know that a lot of the current generation and people training really don't get that much discussion, I think, about the I Ching, but for people like John Beebe and myself, it's really pretty central to our lives, both personally and as analysts. So when the I Ching has penetrated your dream life, you know it is sunk in pretty deeply into your psyche.
What's your thoughts about the relationship between dynasty and archetypes?
Between what and archetype?
Fate and archetypes.
Between fate and archetypes. Oh my God. Yeah. Well, fate. Yeah. That's a big question. Yeah, that would be a good hour lecture right there. Fate and archetypes. Yeah. Well, part of it would be what you're born with in your genetic makeup, and science is discovering that maybe something even as basic as introversion and extroversion and certain psychological traits are things that we're kind of born with as individuals. So that would be the most fundamental in your genes type of fate. And then, boy, then it becomes like a big spiritual and philosophical debate with the many layers of the collective unconscious as something that one would have to take into consideration, like even just being born in America as a white male, versus like being born in a Latin American country that's in chaos. Just the effects that would have on your fate and your future. That would be the second dimension. And the third thing that comes to mind would be related to dreams and the I Ching. And that is, given the circumstances that you're in, how do you best live with that and work with that? And like I say, that's where you get guidance from your dreams, but especially well illustrated by the I Ching, where the Jing tells you, it's been my experience, and people like John Beebe as well, that the Jing tells you at a very deep level archetypally where you are and how to make the best of that circumstance that you're in. So just off the top of my head, those would be three dimensions that come to mind.
Another question is related to your scientific background. We know that you are an expert on the insects. Do you think the psychology of the insect it also can be interpreted with the archetypal theory?
Oh, wow, I love that question. Yeah. My last, hang on.
老师说他很喜欢流合体的这个问题。
That's why I chose this image for my last volume. And my last chapter in my last volume of the Dairy Farmer's Guide is called Planet of the Insect. So I have diagrams and basic descriptions about insects. And James Hillman, one of the Jungian analysts I really admire, wrote a fabulous article in spring, I think it was 1982 or 4, called Going Bugs. And he looked at the many psychological dimensions of insects in dreams. And I quoted Hillman quite a bit in my article. And one of the reasons I, as an entomologist, am so disturbed by the damage we're doing to the environment relates to what Hillman said. He said that insects have like a cosmic intelligence. They are tuned into the basic energies on the planet. So for various reasons, and I won't go into a lecture about it, but they're very sensitive to temperature and humidity. And they're adapted to live in very specific, unique environments. And because they're so adaptable, that's why we have 2/3 of our species are insects. So the fact that in Europe, the insect numbers have declined in some European countries by 25%, to me is very disturbing as an entomologist. Yeah, Hillman wanted me to do my thesis on insects, but I had just gotten my PhD in insect pathology when I got to Zurich, and I really wanted to put my entomology career behind me. But 30 years later, I paid homage to Hillman and entomology, and I'm also a Pink Floyd fan. So the very last appendix in my very last book, Following Praying Mantis as a Spirit Animal, is called Pink Floyd and the Fly in Life's Ointment. So I amplified two of my favorite Pink Floyd fans with, excuse me, scientific knowledge about insects. So they're everywhere. You usually don't see them until they become problems.
Another question, for you, that is, do you believe in fate?
Do I believe in fate? I would say yes and no. Going back to my earlier answer, and I think basically where I come down is in terms of a position in life is gratitude for the good things that I have in my life and that have happened to me, and gratitude for me discovering Carl Jung, and through Jung the I Ching. So it's what's more significant to me than fate, like I said before, is knowing how to fully live into the archetypal dimensions of one's personal existence. And to do that, like I said, I find help from dreams and the I Ching for being able to do that. So a lot of our fate is like one dimension that sets some certain parameters, but what's more significant in a way is how we live with the parameters that we've been given, and to what degree we can modify those parameters to live more fully. So I notice it's getting pretty late for you guys in China. Maybe I'll close by kind of saying a little more about fate. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but it is unusual and a bit kind of uncanny at times, and then with synchronistic events, even one, I have had the sense that things have happened that have provided great meaning and direction in my life. And it's definitely not something that has come out of my conscious control, but it does give one sense of being guided on a path with, I think of this as the way I describe the sage, kind of like guided on a path with heart and meaning. And that path, like I said, is not under a lot of conscious control. But what is important is when opportunities when open to recognize them and to really get into them and maximize them. It's like when I discovered Jung, it's like, whoa, this is fantastic. And then just some very powerful things started to happen that made it possible for me to go to Zurich and train.
上就发生了一些这个怎么说是非常有影响力的，对他个人产生重大影响的一些事情，包括他这个。
So Coco, I could provide a link that you could send out to people. There's a Jung group in California that asked me to give 2 presentations on how I got from insect pathology to being a Jungian analyst. So in the 1-hour presentation that they did record, and it's online, I described how several dreams that I had helped make that transition. And I even described how I used the I Ching in a crucial situation that helped provide the money for us to go to Zurich. So I'll send that link to you and you can send it out to the students. So I'm going to have to go, and I want to say Shei for asking me to give this course. And they said, thank you very much. I know there are a lot more questions, and I could do this for a lot longer, but I have a session coming up pretty soon. So thank you again.
OK， 那老师后面还有工作哈，我们今天只能停到这里。那也非常荣幸哈，那受到我们邀请来进行这样的一个讲座，也感谢大家。Thank you, Dennis. We benefit so much. Yeah, so rich. Thank you.
Thank you.
大家都把鲜花刷起来哈。对，我们可以这个感谢老师。
OK， 谢谢。
Thank you so much.